A millionaire decided to follow a girl who was walking in a cemetery. As he approached, he fainted upon hearing what the girl was whispering. The autumn wind whispered through the cemetery's ancient oaks as Michael Anderson, a distinguished millionaire known for his sharp business acumen, found himself drawn to an unusual sight. A young girl, no more than 12, knelt before an unmarked grave, her threadbare dress hanging loosely on her thin frame. What caught his attention wasn't just her presence in this solemn place, but the intense, almost haunting way she spoke to the grave. Michael stayed hidden behind a weathered tombstone, his curiosity overwhelming his usual reserved nature. The girl's voice, though barely above a whisper, carried clearly in the still morning air. "I took her life," she murmured, her small hands trembling as they placed a wilted flower on the grave. "I didn't mean to, but it was my fault. Everything changed that day. I was just trying to escape, just trying to survive, but now..." Her voice cracked with emotion. Michael felt his heart race as he listened. The girl continued, unaware of her audience. "They all think I'm guilty, and maybe they're right. The lady fell because of me. I ran away instead of helping. Mr. Hughes says I deserve to be punished, that I'm evil." She paused, wiping tears from her dirt-streaked face. "But you would understand, wouldn't you? You always said there were two sides to every story." Something about her words, the raw pain in her voice, struck Michael deeply. This wasn't the confession of a hardened criminal, it was the desperate plea of a child drowning in guilt and fear. But before he could process his thoughts, she spoke again. "I see her face every night in my dreams. The way she looked at me before she fell, I can't forget it. Maybe if I had stayed, maybe if I hadn't been running..." The girl's words became increasingly distressed, each sentence weighted with a burden too heavy for her young shoulders. The world seemed to spin around Michael. The implications of what he was hearing, combined with the innocent desperation in the girl's voice, created a dizzying contradiction. His vision blurred, his knees weakened, and before he could steady himself, he collapsed to the ground with a heavy thud. The last thing he saw before losing consciousness was the girl's startled face turning toward him, her eyes wide with fear and recognition. In that brief moment, he saw something that would haunt him, not guilt, but a profound sadness that no child should ever have to bear. If this haunting opening has touched your soul and awakened your curiosity about Sarah's fate, join our storytelling community by subscribing. Each subscription fuels our passion to bring you more compelling narratives that explore the depths of human resilience and redemption. Sarah Miller and her mother Emily lived in a modest apartment on the outskirts of Boston, where the morning sun would peek through their small kitchen window, casting warm shadows across their breakfast table. Despite their financial struggles, their home was filled with love, laughter, and the sweet aroma of Emily's freshly brewed coffee. Emily worked 2 jobs to support them, as a waitress during the day and a cleaning lady in the evenings. Yet she never let exhaustion dim her bright smile or dampen her spirit. Every morning she would wake up early to prepare Sarah's favorite breakfast, even if it meant sacrificing her own rest. Their morning ritual became sacred, Emily cutting fresh fruit, while Sarah played with her cherished rag doll, the one her mother had lovingly sewn with scraps of fabric during her rare free moments. Their apartment might have been small, with peeling wallpaper and creaky floorboards, but to Sarah it was a palace. Every corner held precious memories, the height marks penciled on the kitchen doorframe, the small collection of second-hand books they would read together at bedtime, and the window seat where they would sit and dream about their future together. Emily had a special way of making everything magical, even their financial limitations. When they couldn't afford new toys, she would create elaborate stories about Sarah's rag doll having grand adventures. When the heating failed in winter, she would wrap them both in blankets and pretend they were explorers in the Arctic, serving hot chocolate in their igloo. Sarah excelled at school, driven by her mother's constant encouragement. Emily would sit with her every evening, helping with homework despite her own exhaustion. "Education is the key to your dreams, sweetheart," she would say. her eyes twinkling with pride as Sarah mastered each new lesson. Their weekends were precious, filled with simple pleasures that cost nothing but meant everything. They would walk in the nearby park, collecting fallen leaves and making up stories about the shapes of clouds. Emily taught Sarah to find beauty in the smallest things: a dandelion pushing through a crack in the sidewalk, the melody of rain against their window, the dance of dust motes in a sunbeam. In their tiny kitchen, Emily passed down family recipes, teaching Sarah to make cookies from scratch and soup that could cure any ailment. These cooking lessons were more than just about food. They were moments of connection, filled with flour-dusted giggles and shared secrets. The bond between mother and daughter was unshakable. When Sarah had nightmares, Emily would hold her close, singing soft lullabies until the fears melted away. When bullies at school mocked Sarah's second-hand clothes, Emily would remind her that true worth lay in kindness and character, not in material possessions. Emily's love was constant and unconditional. She never let Sarah see her cry when bills piled up or when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. Instead, she would gather her daughter in her arms and say, "As long as we have each other, we have everything we need." Their evening routine was sacred homework, dinner, and then stories on their worn but comfortable couch. Emily would brush Sarah's hair, weaving tales of brave princesses who didn't need rescuing because they were strong and smart on their own. These stories shaped Sarah's understanding of strength and resilience, though she didn't realize it at the time. Despite their hardships, there was always laughter in their home. Emily had a way of turning difficulties into adventures and challenges into opportunities for growth. She taught Sarah that happiness wasn't found in what you had, but in how you chose to see the world and treat others. Little did they know that their perfect world, built on love and simple joys, was about to be shattered. But these memories of their life together would become Sarah's anchor in the storm that was to come, a reminder of the love and strength her mother had instilled in her. The day that changed everything began like any other. Sarah watched from their apartment window as her mother crossed the busy street, heading to the grocery store to buy supplies for their planned tea party. Emily turned back to wave, her smile as bright as the morning sun, unaware that this would be their final goodbye. Sarah pressed her small hands against the window glass, her heart suddenly gripped by an inexplicable dread. The street below was crowded with morning commuters, cars moving in an endless stream of metal and noise. She saw her mother waiting at the crosswalk, holding a worn leather purse, the one Sarah had decorated with painted flowers for her last birthday. Time seemed to slow down as Emily began to cross during a green light. Sarah's eyes caught sight of a speeding car, its driver distracted by a phone call, approaching the intersection with no sign of slowing down. The world around her fell silent as she watched in horror, her voice caught in her throat before erupting in a desperate scream. "Mom, look out!" But her warning came too late. The impact was devastating. Sarah witnessed her mother's body thrown several feet into the air, her grocery list scattering like autumn leaves in the wind. The sound of screeching brakes and horrified gasps from bystanders pierced the morning air. Sarah's legs moved before her mind could process what was happening, carrying her down the stairs and onto the street. Racing toward her mother's motionless form, Sarah's world compressed into a tunnel of panic and denial. The concrete was stained crimson, and scattered groceries lay broken around Emily's body. "Mum," she whimpered, dropping to her knees beside her mother. "Mum, please wake up. You promised we'd have our tea party. You promised you'd come back quickly." Emily's eyes were half closed, her breathing shallow and labored. Sarah grabbed her mother's hand, the same hand that had brushed away her tears and tucked her into bed countless times, now growing colder with each passing moment. "Please don't leave me," Sarah begged, her voice breaking. "I don't know how to live without you. I can't do this alone." A crowd gathered, some calling for help, others standing in shocked silence. To Sarah, they were merely shadows in the periphery of her vision. All she could focus on was her mother's face, willing those familiar eyes to open, those loving lips to smile and tell her everything would be okay. The wail of approaching sirens grew louder, but to Sarah they seemed to come from another world entirely. She clung to her mother's hand, whispering desperate prayers to any deity who would listen. "Please, God, don't take my mummy. She's all I have. I'll do anything, just please let her stay with me." Paramedics arrived, their urgent voices and swift movements creating a chaos of activity around them. They tried to pull Sarah away, but she fought against their gentle hands, refusing to let go of her mother. "No, I need to stay with her. She needs me," she screamed, her voice raw with emotion. Finally, a kind-faced paramedic knelt beside her. "Sweetheart, we need to help your mom. You need to let us do our job." His words, though gentle, carried a weight that broke through Sarah's panic. She allowed herself to be moved aside, watching helplessly as they worked to save her mother. But despite their best efforts, Emily Miller slipped away in the ambulance, leaving behind a daughter whose world had just shattered into irreparable pieces. The last words Sarah heard her mother whisper were barely audible. "I love you, my brave girl." In the days that followed, Sarah would replay that morning countless times in her mind, her mother's final wave, the sound of the impact, the scattered groceries on the blood-stained pavement. Each memory was a knife twisting in her heart, a reminder of how quickly happiness could be stolen away. The driver of the car was never found, leaving Sarah with not even the cold comfort of justice. Instead, she was left alone with her grief, facing a world that suddenly seemed impossibly large and frighteningly empty without her mother's loving presence to guide her. The day after the funeral, Sarah returned to find their apartment door locked, a harsh-faced landlady standing guard with crossed arms. "Your mother owed 3 months' rent," she stated coldly. "I need the unit cleared. Everything's been removed. Find somewhere else to go." Sarah stood there, her world crumbling further. The few possessions they had, her mother's recipes, her treasured rag doll, the height marks on the doorframe, all gone. The landlady's words echoed in her head, "Find somewhere else to go." But where could a 12-year-old girl with empty pockets and a broken heart go? The streets of Boston proved merciless. Sarah wandered through neighborhoods she once walked with her mother, now seeing them through different eyes. The bitter autumn wind cut through her thin jacket, and hunger became a constant companion. She slept on park benches, in abandoned doorways, always clutching her mother's last photograph, the only possession she'd managed to save. After 3 days of hunger that felt like knives in her stomach, Sarah found herself outside Jackson Hughes' restaurant. The smell of cooking food made her dizzy with longing. Gathering her courage, she approached the owner, her voice trembling. "Please, sir, I haven't eaten in days. Could you spare anything? Even scraps?" Hughes, a tall man with cold eyes and a stained apron, looked down at her with calculated interest. His response seemed kind at first. "You want food? You'll have to earn it. Clean the floors and I'll give you something to eat." Sarah nodded eagerly, not recognizing the predatory gleam in his eyes. But the work was backbreaking. Hour after hour, Sarah scrubbed the greasy floors on her hands and knees. Her fingers cracked and bled from the harsh cleaning chemicals, but hunger drove her forward. When she finished, Hughes threw her a piece of stale bread, watching with cruel amusement as she devoured it. "Come back tomorrow," he commanded. "There's more work if you want to eat." Sarah knew she had no choice. The next day she returned, and the next, and the next. Each day the work grew harder, the hours longer, and Hughes' demands more excessive. Soon he stopped letting her leave. "You'll sleep in the corner," he declared. "Can't have you running off when there's work to be done." The restaurant became her prison, the corner her bed, and Hughes her tormentor. He fed her just enough to keep her working, but never enough to give her strength to resist. Other employees saw what was happening but turned blind eyes. Some whispered sympathetically but did nothing, afraid of losing their own jobs. Others treated her as invisible, another shadow in Hughes' domain. Sarah's world shrank to the restaurant's walls, her dreams of escape fading with each passing day. At night, curled up in her corner, Sarah would whisper to her mother's photograph. "I'm trying to be brave, Mum," she'd say through silent tears. "But I don't know how much longer I can do this." The photograph never answered, but sometimes in her dreams she could still feel her mother's warm embrace. The days blurred together in an endless cycle of work and exhaustion. Sarah's only respite came in brief moments when she could look out the restaurant windows, watching free people walk by, remembering a time when she too had a home, a mother's love, and hope for the future. But those moments grew shorter as Hugh's control tightened and the light in Sarah's eyes began to dim, replaced by the vacant stare of someone merely surviving, no longer living. Life at Hugh's restaurant settled into a nightmarish routine. Each morning, Sarah would wake before dawn, her body aching from sleeping on the hard floor. The sound of Hugh's unlocking the restaurant door would send shivers down her spine, marking the beginning of another day of endless labor. Hughes took particular pleasure in creating impossible tasks. "Clean every tile with a toothbrush," he would command, watching as Sarah's small hands trembled with exhaustion. "And if I find a single spot, you'll do it all again." He'd inspect her work with exaggerated scrutiny, often deliberately spilling something just to make her start over. The kitchen became a chamber of torments. During the busy lunch rush, Hughes would force Sarah to carry stacks of heavy plates, far too many for her thin arms to manage. When she inevitably stumbled, he'd dock her already meager food allowance, claiming she was wasting resources. Other employees watched in uncomfortable silence as she gathered broken shards with bleeding fingers. But Sarah learned to become invisible, especially when Hughes had important customers. She'd hide in the shadows, scrubbing floors and washing dishes, trying to avoid his unpredictable moods. Some days he'd withhold food entirely, claiming she hadn't earned it. "Ungrateful children don't deserve to eat," he'd sneer, watching her stomach growl with cruel satisfaction. The worst moments came during health inspections. Hughes would lock Sarah in the basement, threatening severe consequences if she made a sound. The dark, damp space was filled with rats and the stench of rotting food, but she learned to suppress her terror, knowing the alternative would be worse. Other restaurant workers showed occasional kindness when Hughes wasn't looking. Maria, the elderly dishwasher, would sometimes slip Sarah extra scraps of food, while Tom, the delivery boy, once gave her a warm jacket he'd outgrown. But these small mercies were rare, as Hughes had made it clear that anyone helping the vagrant would be immediately fired. The physical toll was visible. Sarah's clothes hung loose on her increasingly fragile frame, her once bright eyes now sunken and dull. But the emotional abuse was even more devastating. Hughes would regularly remind her that she was worthless, that no one would believe her if she complained, that she should be grateful he didn't turn her over to the authorities. "You're nothing but street trash," he would say, his voice dripping with contempt. "I've given you a roof over your head, food in your belly. You owe me everything." Sarah began to believe him, her mother's loving words fading under the constant barrage of Hugh's psychological warfare. At night, when the restaurant was finally quiet, Sarah would curl up in her corner, wrapped in newspapers for warmth. She'd take out her mother's worn photograph, tracing her face with a trembling finger. "I'm sorry, Mum," she'd whisper. "I'm sorry I'm not stronger." The tears would come then, silent and bitter, until exhaustion finally granted her brief respite in sleep. The restaurant's regular customers never suspected the truth behind their meals. They saw a clean establishment, enjoyed their food, and left generous tips that Hughes pocketed with a satisfied smile. None noticed the small shadow moving between tables, the child whose childhood was being stolen one day at a time. Sarah developed strategies for survival. She learned to gauge Hugh's moods by the sound of his footsteps, to anticipate his demands before he made them, to make herself so useful that he wouldn't follow through on his threats to throw her out. But each adaptation came at the cost of another piece of her soul. Some nights, when the pain and hunger were particularly bad, Sarah would dream of escape. She'd imagine running away, finding someone who would help her, returning to the life she once knew. but Hughes had planted deep roots of fear in her mind. "Nobody out there wants you," he'd say. "You'll end up dead in a gutter. At least here you have a purpose." The seasons changed outside the restaurant windows, but Sarah's world remained frozen in an endless cycle of work and fear. Summer heat made the kitchen unbearable, winter cold seeped through the thin walls of her corner, yet Hughes' demands never lessened. He had created a perfect system of exploitation, using Sarah's youth and vulnerability to maintain complete control. Each passing day stripped away another layer of Sarah's identity, replacing it with the survival instincts of a trapped animal. She became what Hughes wanted: a silent, obedient worker who existed only to serve his needs. The vibrant, hopeful child who once lived with her mother seemed to belong to another lifetime, another world far removed from the harsh reality of Hughes' restaurant. The abuse at Hughes' restaurant escalated gradually, like a slowly tightening noose. Hughes discovered that emotional torment was his most effective weapon, and he wielded it with calculated precision. He began playing cruel mind games, offering Sarah glimpses of kindness only to snatch them away with devastating effect. On particularly busy days, he would parade Sarah in front of the kitchen staff, pointing out her mistakes with exaggerated disgust. "Look at this filthy creature," he would announce, grabbing her arm roughly. "Can't even clean a simple spot properly. Maybe she likes living like an animal." The other workers would avert their eyes, their silence a tacit endorsement of his cruelty. The physical demands grew increasingly brutal. Hughes would force Sarah to carry heavy boxes up and down the basement stairs until her legs trembled and gave way. When she collapsed from exhaustion, he would stand over her, taunting, "Get up, you worthless thing. Your mother would be ashamed to see you so weak." These words cut deeper than any physical pain, striking at the core of Sarah's most vulnerable memories. Food became a weapon of control. Hughes would prepare elaborate meals for his customers while Sarah watched, her stomach cramping with hunger. Sometimes he would place a plate of fresh food in front of her, only to snatch it away and replace it with moldy bread, laughing at her disappointment. "Beggars can't be choosers," he would say, watching her choke down the stale food. The basement became her special torture chamber. Hughes would send her down there for hours to clean, knowing she was terrified of the dark and the rats. The damp air made her cough, but he refused to let her take breaks. The vermin should feel right at home with their own kind, he would sneer, locking the door behind her. Sleep deprivation became another form of torment. Hughes would wake her in the middle of the night, claiming the floors needed immediate cleaning. Sarah would scrub through her exhaustion, her vision blurring, while he watched from his office, sipping coffee and making occasional disparaging remarks about her technique. The psychological warfare was relentless. Hughes would leave newspapers lying around with stories about homeless children being found dead or taken by social services. "See what happens to street rats who don't appreciate a good situation," he would say, making sure Sarah saw the headlines. "At least here you have a purpose, even if you're too stupid to realize it." Personal hygiene became another point of humiliation. Hughes allowed Sarah only brief, cold showers in the restaurant's utility room, timing her with his watch. 3 minutes he would bark. "Any longer and you're wasting my water." She would rush through the icy spray, trying to wash away the kitchen grime while he stood guard outside, counting down the seconds loudly. Her clothes, already worn when she arrived, began to fall apart. Hughes refused to provide new ones, forcing her to wear the same tattered garments day after day. When customers complained about her appearance, he would berate her publicly, as if her poverty were a personal choice rather than a result of his abuse. The other employees' complicity deepened Sarah's isolation. Some would whisper comforting words when Hughes wasn't around, but none dared to intervene directly. A few even joined in the abuse, perhaps hoping to curry favor with their boss. "At least we earn our keep," they would mutter when passing her. "We're not charity cases." Hughes took particular pleasure in destroying any small comforts Sarah managed to find. If she created a slightly softer bed from cardboard in her corner, he would soak it with water. If she saved a small portion of food for later, he would find it and throw it away, forcing her to watch. "Learning to hide things, are we?" he would say. "Thieves get thrown in jail, you know." The worst moments came when Hughes had been drinking. His natural cruelty would sharpen, becoming more focused and creative. He would make Sarah stand in the corner for hours, holding heavy pots above her head, or force her to scrub the same spot repeatedly until her hands bled. Any sign of weakness would trigger a torrent of verbal abuse about her worthlessness and ingratitude. Through it all, Sarah retreated deeper into herself, building walls around her heart to survive. The bright, loving child who once lived with her mother became a distant memory, replaced by a shadow that moved silently through the restaurant, trying to become invisible. Her only respite came in the few precious moments before sleep, when she could take out her mother's photograph and remember a time when she was loved, when she was more than just Hugh's personal servant, when she was still human. The day that changed everything began with Hughes in one of his darkest moods. A health inspector had scheduled a surprise visit, and his anxiety manifested as increased cruelty towards Sarah. He had already forced her to clean the entire restaurant twice, each time finding imaginary flaws that required her to start over. "You're going to ruin everything," he snarled, pacing the kitchen like a caged animal. "When the inspector comes, you'll hide in the basement. If you make a sound, if anyone discovers you're here," he left the threat unfinished. But Sarah understood. The basement, with its darkness and rats, awaited. But something in Sarah had reached its breaking point. Perhaps it was the way Hughes had thrown away her mother's photograph the day before, calling it sentimental garbage. Though she'd managed to retrieve it from the trash later, something inside her had snapped. As Hughes turned his back, distracted by a delivery at the front door, Sarah saw her chance. She ran. Her legs, weak from malnutrition and exhaustion, carried her through the kitchen's back door and into the street. The sudden sunlight blinded her, but she didn't stop. Freedom, however brief, gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. Behind her, she heard Hugh's angry shout, but it only made her run faster. Sarah darted through alleys and side streets, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. She had no destination in mind. Her only thought was to put as much distance as possible between herself and the restaurant. The world around her was a blur of colors and sounds, all foreign after months of confinement. Then it happened. As she rounded a corner at full speed, she collided with an elderly woman who was carefully crossing the street. The impact sent both of them sprawling. The woman, Mrs. Eleanor Bennett, Hugh's grandmother, fell heavily to the pavement. Her shopping bag spilled its contents across the sidewalk, groceries rolling in all directions. Time seemed to stop. Sarah watched in horror as Mrs. Bennett lay motionless on the ground. People began gathering, some rushing to help, others pointing at Sarah accusingly. She stood frozen, her mind racing between the instinct to help and the urge to flee. "Someone call an ambulance," a voice shouted. The crowd grew larger, and Sarah could hear sirens in the distance. Panic overwhelmed her. If she stayed, Hughes would find her. If she ran, she'd be leaving an injured woman behind. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory, "Always help those in need, sweetheart." But fear won out. With tears streaming down her face, Sarah turned and ran again, this time with the added weight of guilt pressing down on her shoulders. Behind her she could hear people shouting, calling her a heartless child, a criminal. Each word felt like a physical blow. She didn't stop running until she reached a small park several blocks away. Hidden behind some bushes, she finally allowed herself to break down. The reality of what had happened hit her full force. She had hurt someone, an innocent elderly woman who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. From her hiding spot, Sarah watched as an ambulance sped past, sirens wailing. She hugged her knees to her chest, rocking back and forth as sobs racked her body. "I'm sorry," she whispered repeatedly, though there was no one to hear her apology. "I didn't mean to. I was just trying to get away." As the day wore on, Sarah's guilt grew heavier. She couldn't shake the image of Mrs. Bennet lying on the pavement, couldn't forget the accusations in the onlookers' eyes. The freedom she'd sought now felt tainted, poisoned by the knowledge that she'd hurt someone in her desperate bid to escape. Later that evening, she crept back to the scene of the accident. The street had returned to normal, no sign remaining of what had transpired except for a few scattered groceries that had been missed in the cleanup. Sarah picked up a bruised apple, turning it over in her trembling hands. The weight of her actions pressed down on her soul. She had fled from one nightmare only to create another. The thought that she might have seriously injured or even killed someone was unbearable. In that moment, Sarah felt more alone than ever before, trapped between the cruelty she'd escaped and the guilt of what she'd done. As darkness fell, Sarah found herself with nowhere to go and a new burden to carry. Her bid for freedom had come at a terrible price, one that would haunt her in the days to come. She didn't know then that this accident would set in motion a chain of events that would change her life forever, for better and worse. Michael Anderson's first real encounter with Sarah came 3 days after the accident. He had been haunted by the scene he'd witnessed in the cemetery, unable to shake the image of the small girl confessing to an unmarked grave. As CEO of Anderson Enterprises, he was accustomed to making quick, decisive judgments, but something about this situation defied his usual analytical approach. He found her again at the cemetery, this time in the early morning hours. She was curled up behind a large tombstone, shivering in the autumn chill, her clothes even more ragged than before. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her face bore the hollow look of someone who hadn't eaten in days. "You don't need to run," he said softly, keeping his distance to avoid frightening her. "I heard what you said the other day. I want to help." Sarah's eyes darted around, searching for an escape route, but exhaustion had drained her of the energy to flee. "Why would you want to help me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everyone says I'm a criminal. I hurt that lady. I ran away instead of helping." Her tears began streaming down her dirty cheeks, leaving clean tracks in their wake. Michael approached slowly, removing his coat and holding it out to her. "I've been watching you," he admitted. "I've seen you come here every day, talking to this grave. That's not what criminals do. That's what someone with a conscience does." Sarah accepted the coat hesitantly, wrapping it around her thin frame. The warmth seemed to unlock something in her, and words began pouring out about her mother's death, about Hugh's restaurant, about the accident. Michael listened without interruption, his heart growing heavier with each revelation. "Mr. Hughes said no one would believe me," she finished, her voice breaking. "He said I deserve everything that happens to me because I'm worthless." She hugged herself tightly, as if trying to hold together the pieces of her broken spirit. Michael knelt beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "Sarah, look at me," he said gently. "What Hughes did to you was wrong. Forcing a child to work like that, denying you food, keeping you prisoner, those are crimes. The real criminal is him, not you." For the first time, Sarah looked directly into his eyes, searching for any sign of deception. Instead, she found only compassion and determination. But the accident, she began, was exactly that, an accident. Michael finished firmly. "You were running for your freedom, Sarah. Anyone in your situation would have done the same." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. "When was the last time you ate?" he asked, offering it to her. Sarah's hands trembled as she accepted the food, taking small, careful bites as if afraid it might be snatched away. "I have a proposal for you," Michael said as she ate. "Let me help you. I have resources, influence. We can expose what Hughes did to you. We can make sure he never hurts another child again." Sarah froze mid-bite, fear clouding her eyes. "He'll find me," she whispered. "He always finds me." and then he'll—" "No," Michael interrupted firmly, "he won't. I promise you, Sarah. From this moment on, you're under my protection. Hughes won't be able to touch you." He stood up, extending his hand to her. "You don't have to decide right now, but know this: I believe you. I believe in you, and I'm not going anywhere until we make this right." Sarah stared at his offered hand, years of abuse warring with the desperate need to trust someone, anyone. Finally, slowly, she reached out and placed her small hand in his. The simple gesture brought tears to Michael's eyes. He understood the enormous leap of faith she was taking. "First," he said, helping her to her feet, "we're going to get you proper medical care and a hot meal. Then we'll talk about what comes next. But whatever happens, Sarah, remember this: you're not alone anymore." As they walked out of the cemetery together, Sarah clutching Michael's coat around her shoulders, something shifted in the universe. A broken child had found an unlikely protector, and a wealthy man had discovered a purpose greater than business success. Neither of them knew the battles that lay ahead, but in that moment a silent pact was formed. Michael would fight for Sarah with every resource at his disposal, and Sarah would learn gradually, painfully, to trust again. Michael Anderson sat in his office, surrounded by files and documents, his usual pristine desk now cluttered with evidence of his growing investigation into Hughes' restaurant. His personal investigator, James Carter, stood before him, delivering his preliminary findings. "It's worse than we thought," Mr. Anderson, Carter reported, spreading photographs across the desk. "We've identified at least 3 other children who worked there under similar conditions over the past 5 years. All disappeared without trace, either ran away or—" He left the sentence unfinished, its implications hanging heavily in the air. Michael picked up one of the photos, studying the restaurant's exterior. "What about health inspections? Labor regulations? There must be records." Carter shook his head grimly. "That's where it gets interesting. Hughes has connections in the local health department. Every inspection passes with flying colors, but there's no actual documentation of the inspections taking place. It's all paperwork, no substance." While they talked, Sarah was receiving medical care at a private clinic Michael had arranged. The doctor's initial report lay open on his desk: malnutrition, signs of physical abuse, psychological trauma. Reading it had made Michael's blood boil. "We need more," Michael insisted, running a hand through his graying hair. "Hughes is smart. He's been doing this for years without getting caught. We need concrete evidence that will stand up in court." Carter nodded, pulling out another file. "I've been tracking his financial records. There are irregularities, large cash deposits that don't match his reported revenue. But he's careful, keeps everything just below reporting thresholds." The investigation was taking its toll on Michael. Dark circles had formed under his eyes from sleepless nights spent reviewing documents and making connections. But every time he thought about giving up, he remembered Sarah's haunted eyes and found renewed determination. "What about his grandmother?" Michael asked. "The woman Sarah accidentally knocked down. How does she fit into all this?" Carter's expression turned grave. "Mrs. Eleanor Bennett. She was Hughes' only living relative, wealthy in her own right. The hospital records show she died from her injuries," but he paused, shuffling through his papers. The attending physician noted some inconsistencies, symptoms that didn't quite match the trauma from a fall. Michael leaned forward, his interest piqued. "What kind of inconsistencies?" "Traces of an unknown substance in her blood work. The lab couldn't identify it initially, but I had our specialists take a look. They think it might be a rare, hard-to-detect poison, the kind that would take effect slowly, making any subsequent trauma more likely to be fatal." The implications were staggering. Michael stood, pacing his office. "You're suggesting Hughes was poisoning his own grandmother? And Sarah's accident just provided convenient cover?" Carter spread his hands. "It's a theory. We need more evidence, but the timing is suspicious. Mrs. Bennett had recently changed her will, leaving everything to a children's charity instead of Hughes. He would have known about it. He was her lawyer's clerk." The pieces were starting to fall into place, forming a picture more sinister than Michael had initially imagined. Not just child exploitation, but premeditated murder disguised as an accident, with Sarah as an unwitting pawn. "We need to move carefully," Michael cautioned. "Hughes has friends in the police department, the health department, if he suspects we're investigating." "He's already suspicious," Carter interrupted. "My sources say he's been asking questions about you, about your sudden interest in his restaurant. He's worried, Mr. Anderson, and worried men make mistakes." Michael nodded slowly, a plan forming in his mind. "Then let's make him more worried. Arrange for a health inspection, a real one this time. Get someone from the state level, someone he can't bribe. Let's start applying pressure, see what shakes loose." As Carter left to make the arrangements, Michael walked to his window, looking out over the city. Somewhere out there, Hughes was going about his business, probably already planning his next exploitation. The thought made Michael's jaw clench. "We'll get him, Sarah," he whispered to his reflection. "Whatever it takes, we'll make him pay for what he's done." But even as he made this promise, Michael knew the investigation was like walking through a minefield. One wrong step, one piece of evidence mishandled, and everything could explode in their faces. And Sarah, still fragile and recovering, would be the one to suffer most from any failure. The weight of this responsibility settled heavily on his shoulders, but Michael Anderson was no stranger to pressure. He had built his fortune by taking calculated risks and seeing them through. This time, though, the stakes were higher than mere money. This time he was fighting for a child's soul. The accusations began as whispers, spreading through the neighborhood like a poisonous fog. Hughes had been busy, spinning his web of lies with careful precision. People who had seen Sarah at his restaurant now came forward with carefully coached stories about her violent tendencies and unstable behavior. Mrs. Peterson, the bakery owner across the street from Hughes' restaurant, was the first to publicly accuse Sarah. "I saw that girl," she declared to anyone who would listen. "Always skulking around, stealing bread when she thought no one was looking. And the way she ran from the scene after pushing poor Mrs. Bennett like a guilty criminal." The local newspaper picked up the story, painting Sarah as a dangerous street child who had graduated from petty theft to violence against the elderly. The article, carefully orchestrated by Hughes' connections, described her as a troubled youth with a history of aggressive behavior, and questioned Michael Anderson's judgment in harboring her. Sarah discovered the extent of the accusations one morning when she accompanied Michael to a local diner for breakfast. The waitress refused to serve them, throwing the newspaper down on their table. "We don't serve people who hurt defenseless old ladies," she spat, loud enough for everyone to hear. The girl's face crumpled as she read the article, seeing her life twisted into something unrecognizable. "But that's not what happened," she whispered, hands trembling. "I was running away because I was scared. I didn't mean to hurt anyone." Michael watched helplessly as tears rolled down Sarah's cheeks. The other diners stared and whispered, some openly hostile, others merely curious about the supposed dangerous child in their midst. He led her out quickly, but the damage was done. The accusations escalated. Anonymous calls to Child Protective Services suggested Sarah was mentally unstable and dangerous. Letters arrived at Michael's office questioning his company's integrity for supporting a known criminal. Some of his business associates began cancelling meetings, citing concerns about association with controversy. Hughes played his part masterfully, appearing grief-stricken over his grandmother's death, while subtly feeding the flames of suspicion. "I tried to help her," he would say, shaking his head sadly. "I gave her work when no one else would. But there was always something wrong with her. I should have seen it coming." Sarah became a virtual prisoner in Michael's home, afraid to go outside where people might recognize her. She spent hours staring out windows, jumping at shadows, convinced that every passing car might be Hughes coming to take her away. The vibrant spirit that had begun to emerge under Michael's care started to withdraw again. One evening as they sat in his study, Sarah finally broke down. "Maybe they're right," she sobbed. "Maybe I am bad." Everything I touch gets ruined. Your reputation, Mrs. Bennet. My mum, her words dissolved into heart-wrenching cries. Michael knelt beside her chair, taking her small hands in his. Listen to me, Sarah. These accusations, they're not about you. They're about Hughes trying to protect himself. He's afraid of what you know, of what you represent. That's why he's doing this. But the weight of public opinion was crushing. Even with Michael's protection, Sarah felt the pressure of being branded a criminal. She overheard his housekeeper questioning her presence, saw the security guards exchange uncertain glances when she passed. The final blow came when a group of parents organized a protest outside Michael's office building, demanding he stop protecting a dangerous individual and think of the community's safety news cameras captured Sarah watching from an upstairs window, her pale face making headlines once again. That night, Michael found Sarah packing her few belongings into a small bag. I have to leave, she said, her voice small but determined. I'm only making things worse for you. Hughes won't stop until he destroys everything, and it's all my fault. Michael took the bag from her hands, setting it aside. Running away won't solve anything, he said firmly. It's exactly what Hughes wants for you to disappear, to take his secrets with you. We fight this together, or not at all. Sarah looked up at him, seeing the unwavering conviction in his eyes. For a moment she wavered between fear and hope, between flight and fight. Then, slowly, she nodded, though her voice trembled as she spoke. But what if they're right? What if I am what they say I am? Michael pulled her into a protective embrace, his voice fierce with determination. You are not what they say. You are a survivor, a fighter, and most importantly, you are not alone anymore. Let them talk. The truth will come out, and when it does, Hughes will be the one running. But even as he made this promise, Michael knew the battle was far from over. The accusations were just the beginning, and Hughes had more weapons in his arsenal. The question was, could Sarah's fragile spirit survive what was yet to come? Michael Anderson had faced many challenges in his business career, but nothing had prepared him for the complexity of protecting a traumatized child from both physical threats and psychological warfare. His mansion, once a showcase of wealth and success, transformed into a fortress of safety for Sarah. He hired additional security personnel, carefully vetted by his most trusted investigators. Cameras were installed at every entrance, and protocols were established for visitors. Even the gardens were monitored, with guards patrolling the perimeter day and night. Sarah's safety became his primary concern, superseding even his business responsibilities. The psychological protection proved more challenging. Michael brought in Dr. Rachel Stevens, a renowned child psychologist specializing in trauma. Their first sessions were held in Michael's study, the only place where Sarah felt safe enough to speak. She's carrying profound trauma, Dr. Stevens reported privately. Not just from Hughes, but from losing her mother, being homeless, and now these accusations. She needs stability, patience, and unconditional support. Michael took this advice to heart. He established routines, knowing Sarah needed predictability after the chaos of her life. Breakfast became their special time together, where they would plan their day while sharing pancakes or waffles. He noticed she always saved a portion of her food, hiding it in napkins, a habit from her days of uncertain meals at Hughes' restaurant. Instead of commenting, he simply ensured snacks were always available in her room. Education became another focus. Sarah had missed months of schooling, but her intelligence shone through despite the gaps in her knowledge. Michael hired private tutors who came to the house, working at her pace. He would often find her late at night, surrounded by books, determined to catch up on everything she had missed. You don't have to push yourself so hard, he told her one evening, finding her asleep over her mathematics textbook. We have time. Sarah's response broke his heart. But what if you change your mind about me? I need to be worth keeping. It took hours of gentle conversation to convince her that his support wasn't conditional on her achievements. The legal battle required a different kind of protection. Michael assembled a team of the best lawyers in the state, led by Catherine Martinez, a fierce advocate for children's rights. They worked tirelessly to build a case against Hughes while protecting Sarah from the legal system's harsh realities. "We need her testimony," Catherine explained during a strategy session, "but we also need to shield her from direct confrontation with Hughes. The psychological impact could be devastating." They developed a plan to record Sarah's statement in a controlled environment with Dr. Stevens present for support. The media attention presented another challenge. Reporters camped outside the mansion, hoping to catch a glimpse of the dangerous street child being harbored by one of the city's most prominent citizens. Michael hired a public relations team not to spin the story, but to maintain silence. "The truth will come out in court," he insisted. "Until then, we protect Sarah's privacy at all costs." Some nights were harder than others. Sarah's nightmares would pierce the quiet of the mansion, her screams echoing through the halls. Michael would find her huddled in corners, reliving moments of terror from the restaurant. He learned to sit with her, not too close, speaking softly until she remembered where she was, who she was with. "I see him," she would whisper, eyes wide with fear. "He's coming to take me back. He says I belong to him." "You belong to yourself," Michael would respond firmly, "and you're safe here." I promise you that these episodes became less frequent over time, but each one reinforced his determination to see Hughes brought to justice. The financial cost of protecting Sarah was enormous: security, education, legal fees, therapy, but Michael never hesitated. When his financial advisors expressed concern about the mounting expenses, he simply redirected more resources from his personal accounts. "Some things are worth more than money," he told them. Michael also worked to protect Sarah's connection to her mother's memory. He helped her create a memory book, filling it with the few photos they could find and Sarah's written memories of their life together. When they discovered her mother's grave had been unmarked due to lack of funds, Michael arranged for a beautiful headstone to be placed there. The hardest part was watching Sarah struggle with trust. Even after months in his care, she would sometimes flinch when he moved too quickly, or apologize profusely for minor accidents. Each instance was a reminder of the deep wounds Hughes had inflicted, wounds that would take years to heal. Yet there were moments of breakthrough that made every effort worthwhile. The first time Sarah laughed genuinely at breakfast. The day she fell asleep on the couch during a movie, completely at ease. The morning she asked if she could call him Uncle Michael. These small victories kept him going through the darkest times. Through it all, Michael learned that protection wasn't just about physical safety or legal defense. It was about creating a space where a broken child could begin to heal, where trust could slowly rebuild, and where hope could take root again. It was about being the adult who stood firm when others walked away, who believed when others doubted, who fought when others surrendered. Each day brought new challenges, but Michael remained unwavering in his commitment. He had made a promise to Sarah in that cemetery, and he intended to keep it, no matter the cost. The breakthrough in Sarah's case came from an unexpected source. Maria Gonzalez, the elderly dishwasher who had shown small kindnesses to Sarah during her imprisonment at the restaurant, finally found the courage to come forward. She arrived at Michael's office one rainy afternoon, clutching a worn leather bag and shaking with nervousness. "I should have spoken sooner," Maria said, her voice trembling. "But Mr. Hughes, he threatened my family. Said he would have my son deported if I ever told anyone what I saw." She opened her bag, pulling out a small notebook filled with dates, times, and detailed observations of Hughes' treatment of Sarah and his suspicious activities. Maria had documented everything: the hours Sarah worked, the food she was denied, the verbal and physical abuse. But more crucially, she had recorded conversations she'd overheard between Hughes and his grandmother in the weeks before the accident. "He was poisoning her slowly," Maria explained, "adding something to her tea every morning. I saw him do it, but I was too afraid to say anything." The notebook contained precise details about Hughes' behavior after his grandmother changed her will. Maria had recorded his rage, his threatening comments, and most importantly, his admission of guilt during a phone conversation she had overheard. "He didn't know I was there," she said. "He was talking to someone about making sure his grandmother had an accident before the new will could be filed." Michael's legal team moved quickly to verify Maria's evidence. They found credit card receipts matching dates in her notebook when Hughes had purchased unusual chemicals. They tracked down the changed will, still waiting to be filed with the court, which would have disinherited Hughes completely. The investigation expanded to Hughes' computer records. A forensic team discovered encrypted emails between Hughes and various officials he had bribed over the years. There were arrangements for fake health inspections, payments to police officers to look the other way, and even communications about other children he had exploited before Sarah. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected place. Hughes, in his arrogance, had kept detailed records of his grandmother's declining health, documenting the progression of her poisoning as if it were a scientific experiment. These records were hidden in a secret compartment in his office, which Maria had seen him accessing late at night. Sarah's reaction to these discoveries was complex. When Michael gently shared what they had found, she broke down crying. She knew Sarah sobbed. "Mrs. Bennet knew what he was doing to me. She tried to help by changing her will, and he killed her for it. And then he used me to cover it up." The evidence painted a picture of calculated evil that shocked even the most hardened investigators. Hughes had not just exploited vulnerable children, he had created a sophisticated system of corruption and intimidation to protect his activities. The restaurant had been his fortress, and Sarah had been just the latest in a long line of victims. Maria's testimony opened the floodgates. Other former employees began coming forward, each with their own stories of witness Hughes' cruelty. They brought photographs, videos secretly recorded on phones, and years of suppressed guilt about their silence. A former cook revealed how Hughes would force Sarah to sleep in the freezing basement when he was particularly angry, timing her exposure to ensure she wouldn't develop hypothermia but would suffer maximum discomfort. A delivery driver admitted to seeing Hughes strike Sarah when she dropped a box of supplies, then threatened to kill her if she told anyone. The most heartbreaking evidence came from Sarah herself. With Dr. Stevens' support, she began drawing pictures of her time in the restaurant. These artwork pieces, though crude, captured the horror of her experience with devastating clarity. One particular drawing showed her huddled in her corner at night, surrounded by rats, while Hughes watched from his office window, smiling. Michael's investigators also uncovered Hughes' financial records, revealing a pattern of money laundering and tax evasion. The restaurant had been profitable, but Hughes had been stealing from his own business to fund a gambling addiction. His grandmother's fortune had been his last hope of avoiding bankruptcy. As the evidence mounted, Hughes' carefully constructed facade began to crumble. His political connections distanced themselves, his business associates disappeared, and his lawyers started negotiating plea deals. The man who had seemed untouchable was suddenly very vulnerable indeed. The final piece of evidence came from an unexpected source: Hughes' own security cameras. He had installed them to monitor his victims, but they had also recorded his crimes. The footage showed him mixing poison into his grandmother's food, abusing Sarah, and later celebrating when he learned of his grandmother's death. This mountain of evidence represented not just proof of Hughes' crimes, but validation of Sarah's suffering. Each new discovery reinforced what she had been trying to tell people all along, that she was a victim, not a criminal. The truth was finally coming to light, and with it came the first real possibility of justice. But for Sarah, the evidence brought mixed emotions. While it proved her innocence, it also forced her to relive her trauma. Each new revelation was both a victory and a reminder of the darkness she had endured. Michael made sure she had constant support during this period, never leaving her to face these discoveries alone. The evidence would prove crucial in the legal battles to come, but its immediate impact was on Sarah's healing process. Finally, she could begin to trust that people would believe her story, that her nightmare would be acknowledged, and that Hughes would face consequences for his actions. Despite the mounting evidence against Hughes, the community's opposition to Sarah grew more intense. Hughes had spent years cultivating his image as a respected business owner, and many people refused to believe the truth about him, even when confronted with proof of his crimes. Local business owners, longtime customers of Hughes' restaurant, organized boycotts of Michael's companies. Signs appeared in shop windows: "Protect our community, stand against child criminals." The local paper, influenced by Hughes' connections, ran daily articles questioning Michael's motives for protecting Sarah, suggesting he was using her to destroy a business rival. Parents began pulling their children from the private school Sarah had started attending remotely. "We can't risk our children being exposed to someone like that," they claimed in a petition demanding her complete isolation from the community. The school administration, feeling pressure from wealthy donors, suggested it might be better for everyone if Sarah continued her education at home. Church groups that had once praised Hughes for his charitable donations now held prayer vigils outside Michael's mansion, not to support Sarah, but to pray for the soul of the child who had brought such darkness to their community. Their hymns would drift through Sarah's window at night, making her feel like a prisoner in her sanctuary. The opposition took a darker turn when anonymous threats began arriving at Michael's office. Letters described in graphic detail what should happen to child murderers and those who protected them. Security had to be doubled, and Sarah's movements became even more restricted. The psychological impact was severe. She began having panic attacks whenever she heard crowds outside the gates. Local politicians, sensing the public mood, made statements distancing themselves from Michael's crusade. Some even suggested launching investigations into his business practices, thinly veiled attempts at intimidation. Hughes' influence ran deep, and he was calling in every favor he had accumulated over the years. Social media became a battlefield. Photos of Sarah were circulated with false stories attached, claiming she had a history of violence in other cities. Fake accounts spread rumors about her background, suggesting she was part of a gang targeting elderly victims. Each new lie seemed to find eager believers. The few people who tried to speak in Sarah's defense faced immediate backlash. Maria, after her testimony became public, had her car vandalized and received so many threats she had to move to a different neighborhood. Other former employees who had come forward found themselves blacklisted from local businesses. Sarah watched all of this with growing despair. "Why do they hate me so much?" she asked Michael one evening, after watching another news report about the community's opposition. "They don't even know me." The weight of being cast as a villain in her own story was almost too much to bear. Even some of Michael's oldest friends began to question his judgment. At social events, he found himself increasingly isolated, watching as people who had known him for decades chose to believe Hughes' lies rather than face an uncomfortable truth. The whispers followed him everywhere. Poor Michael, letting himself be manipulated by a criminal child. The opposition reached its peak when a group of local business leaders organized a town hall meeting to discuss the Sarah situation. Hughes attended, playing the role of the grieving grandson perfectly, while speaker after speaker denounced Sarah and Michael. The meeting ended with a resolution demanding that Sarah be removed from the community for public safety. Through it all, Michael remained steadfast. He hired experts to counter the false narratives, organized press conferences to present evidence of Hughes' crimes, and most importantly, continued to provide Sarah with a safe haven from the storm of opposition. "They're afraid," he explained to her. "People fear what threatens their comfortable beliefs. But we won't let their fear stop us from seeking justice." Dr. Stevens helped Sarah understand that the community's reaction was more about their own fears and prejudices than about her. "They've invested years in believing Hughes is a good person," she explained. "Accepting the truth means accepting that they were wrong, that they failed to see evil right in front of them. Some people would rather believe a lie than face that reality." The opposition served to strengthen Michael's resolve. Each new attack, each false accusation, only made him more determined to expose Hughes' crimes and protect Sarah. He knew that eventually the truth would have to prevail, but watching Sarah suffer through the community's rejection tested his faith in humanity. Late at night, when the protesters had gone home and the mansion was quiet, Michael would often find Sarah in the library, reading books about justice and truth. "They'll see eventually, won't they?" she would ask, her voice small but hopeful. "When all the evidence comes out, they'll have to believe the truth." Michael couldn't promise her that everyone would accept the truth, but he could promise that he would never stop fighting for her. The community's opposition was just another obstacle to overcome, another battle in their war for justice. And as long as Sarah kept fighting, kept believing in the possibility of truth prevailing, he would stand beside her, no matter how loud the opposition became. The fire at Hugh's restaurant began on a cold autumn evening, when the streets were quiet and the sky hung heavy with unshed rain. Sarah had sneaked out of Michael's mansion, driven by an inexplicable need to face her demons. She found herself standing in the alley behind the restaurant, staring at the back door that had once been her only connection to the outside world. The familiar smell of grease and cleaning chemicals drifted through the air, triggering memories she'd tried so hard to suppress. Through the kitchen window she could see Hughes moving about, his shadow long and menacing against the fluorescent lights. He was alone, which was unusual for this time of day. Something about his movements seemed frantic, purposeful. Sarah watched as Hughes began pouring liquid from large containers onto the floor, the sharp smell of gasoline reaching her even through the closed windows. Her heart began to race as she realized what he was doing. He was destroying evidence, preparing to burn away his crimes. Without thinking, Sarah slipped through the back door, using the key she'd once hidden for emergencies. The restaurant was eerily quiet, the usual kitchen clatter replaced by the sound of liquid splashing against tile. She crouched behind a counter, watching as Hughes methodically doused every surface, paying special attention to his office where he kept his records. Hughes was talking to himself, his voice a harsh whisper that carried in the silence. "They'll never prove anything. All gone." The girl's word against mine, he laughed, a sound that sent chills down Sarah's spine. And who would believe a street rat? Sarah's presence must have registered somehow, a shifted shadow, a caught breath, because Hughes suddenly stopped, turning slowly toward her hiding place. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice dangerous. "Show yourself." She tried to stay still, to make herself invisible as she had so many times before, but Hughes was already moving toward her position. The smell of gasoline was overwhelming, making her eyes water and her head spin. When he rounded the corner, their eyes met, and time seemed to freeze. Well, Hughes sneered, his face twisting into a familiar expression of cruel amusement. The little rat returns to her cage. "Come to see your old home one last time." He held up a box of matches, waving them tauntingly. "You're just in time for the final act." Sarah scrambled backward, but years of malnutrition and abuse had left her slower than she should have been. Hughes caught her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh with bruising force. "You've caused me quite a lot of trouble," he hissed. "But no one will find anything when I'm done. And if a troublesome little girl happens to be caught in an unfortunate accident, well, that's just tragedy, isn't it?" The sound of a match striking made Sarah's blood run cold. Hughes held the small flame close to her face, letting her feel its heat. "Remember how you used to beg for warmth on cold nights? Let's see how you like it now." With a cruel laugh, he tossed the match. The gasoline-soaked floor erupted instantly, flames racing across the restaurant in hungry lines. Hughes shoved Sarah toward the spreading fire, but years of survival instinct kicked in. She ducked under his arm, darting toward the back of the restaurant. The fire moved faster than seemed possible, cutting off her escape routes one by one. Smoke filled the air, thick and choking, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Sarah could hear Hughes laughing somewhere behind her, the sound mixing with the roar of the flames. The heat was incredible, unlike anything she'd experienced before. Her lungs burned with every breath, and her eyes streamed with tears. Through the smoke, she caught glimpses of the corner, where she used to sleep, now consumed by flames. The kitchen, where she'd spent countless hours scrubbing floors, was disappearing behind a wall of fire. Sarah's world narrowed to the basic instinct of survival. She crawled along the floor, remembering advice from a long-ago fire safety lesson at school. The smoke was thinner near the ground, but the heat from the floor was blistering. Every movement was agony, every breath a struggle. Through the chaos, Sarah heard Hugh's voice one last time: "Burn with your secrets, little rat." Then the sound of a door slamming, leaving her trapped in the inferno. The flames were everywhere now, dancing across the ceiling, consuming everything in their path. Just when despair threatened to overwhelm her, Sarah remembered something: a small window in the storage room, one she'd often stared through during her captivity, dreaming of escape. If she could reach it. If it wasn't blocked. The journey across the burning restaurant was a nightmare of heat, smoke, and terror. Flames licked at her clothes, and twice she had to change direction when burning debris fell in her path. The storage room seemed miles away, though it was only across the kitchen. When she finally reached the window, her strength was nearly gone. The glass was hot to the touch, but Sarah knew it was her only chance. Using a fallen chair, she smashed the window, ignoring the cuts on her hands as she pulled herself through the small opening. The fall to the alley below knocked the remaining breath from her lungs. She lay there gasping as the restaurant burned behind her, watching flames shoot through the roof into the night sky. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air, but Sarah knew Hughes would be long gone, leaving her to take the blame once again. Smoke filled Sarah's lungs as she lay in the alley behind the burning restaurant, each breath more painful than the last. The world around her began to blur, colors merging into a hazy kaleidoscope of emergency lights and dancing flames. Through her fading consciousness, she heard voices shouting, feet running, but they seemed to come from very far away. As her vision darkened, something extraordinary happened. In the midst of the chaos, Sarah saw her mother standing before her, just as beautiful as she remembered, wearing the blue dress she'd worn on their last morning together. "Mom," Sarah whispered, her voice barely a breath. The apparition smiled, radiating love and warmth that seemed to cut through the bitter cold of the alley. "My brave girl," her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "You fought so hard, but you can't give up now. There's still so much life ahead of you." The vision knelt beside her, and Sarah could almost feel the gentle touch she remembered from her childhood. "Get up, sweetheart. Fight one more time for me." Sarah tried to move to reach for her mother, but her body felt impossibly heavy. The smoke had taken its toll, and darkness crept at the edges of her vision. She could hear sirens getting closer, but they seemed less important than the image of her mother before her. "I'm so tired, Mom," she managed to whisper. "Maybe I could just come with you instead." The words came out as a plea, a child's desperate wish to escape the pain and fear that had dominated her life for so long. Her mother's expression turned stern but loving. "No, Sarah, your time isn't now. Michael needs you. The truth needs you. Get up." The command was gentle but firm, filled with the same strength that had gotten them through so many hard times before. Using the last reserves of her strength, Sarah rolled onto her side, trying to push herself up. The movement sent waves of pain through her smoke-damaged lungs, and she collapsed again, coughing violently. The image of her mother began to fade, but her voice remained clear. "Help is coming, sweetheart. Just hold on a little longer." Through the haze of semi-consciousness, Sarah became aware of new voices, urgent and professional. Paramedics had found her, their trained hands checking her vital signs, placing an oxygen mask over her face. She tried to tell them about her mother, about Hughes and the fire, but no words would come. The journey to the hospital was a blur of motion and sound. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, each time seeing glimpses of her mother watching over her. The emergency room was a chaos of activity, doctors shouting orders, nurses rushing to respond, machines beeping urgent warnings about her failing vital signs. Severe smoke inhalation. Second-degree burns. Possible cardiac arrest. The medical terminology floated around her like debris in a storm, meaningless yet somehow threatening. Through it all, she held on to the memory of her mother's words, "Fight one more time." The doctors worked frantically to save her life. Her heart stopped twice on the operating table, and each time, in the moments between life and death, Sarah saw her mother waiting. But each time the same gentle command turned her back. "Not yet, sweetheart. Your story isn't finished." Michael arrived at the hospital in a state of panic, having been notified of Sarah's condition. He paced the waiting room, making calls, demanding the best specialists, praying to a God he hadn't spoken to in years. When the doctors finally let him see her, she was barely recognizable beneath the tubes and bandages. Hours turned into days as Sarah hovered between life and death. The doctors spoke in careful terms about brain damage from oxygen deprivation, about the possibility of permanent lung damage, about the long road to recovery if she survived. Michael never left her side, holding her hand, talking to her about anything and everything, refusing to give up hope. On the third night, when the hospital was quiet except for the steady beep of monitors, Sarah's eyes finally opened. Through cracked lips, she whispered, "Mom sent me back." Michael, half asleep in the chair beside her bed, jolted awake at the sound of her voice. The doctors called it a miracle. Sarah's recovery defied their worst predictions. Though her body was weak and damaged, her spirit seemed stronger than ever. She spoke of her near-death experience with a quiet certainty that made even the most skeptical medical professionals pause. "My mum was there," she told Michael, "when she was strong enough to talk properly. She told me I had to come back, that the truth needed me." She described the vision with such clarity, such conviction, that Michael found himself believing every word. The physical recovery was grueling. Sarah's lungs had been severely damaged by the smoke, and every breath was a reminder of that terrible night. Physical therapy was a daily struggle as she worked to regain her strength. But something had changed within her. The fear that had haunted her eyes since Hugh's abuse was replaced by a quiet determination. This brush with death became a turning point in Sarah's journey. She had faced her worst fear, returning to the restaurant, and though it had nearly killed her, she had survived. More than that, she had been given a gift, the certainty that her mother's love was still with her, watching over her, giving her strength when she needed it most. The near-death experience also provided unexpected evidence. The fire department's investigation revealed traces of gasoline throughout the restaurant, proving it was arson. Sarah's injuries and presence at the scene helped establish Hugh's attempt to silence her permanently. What he had intended as her end became instead another piece in the case against him. The police came for Michael Anderson at dawn, their patrol cars silently surrounding his mansion. They arrived with a warrant, citing charges of conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and endangering a minor. The evidence against him had been carefully fabricated, anonymous witnesses claiming he had orchestrated the restaurant fire to destroy evidence that would have implicated Sarah in Mrs. Bennett's death. Sarah watched in horror from her window as Michael was led out in handcuffs. He held his head high, maintaining his dignity even as photographers swarmed around him like vultures. Their eyes met briefly across the lawn, and he managed to give her a reassuring nod before being placed in the police car. "You can't take him," Sarah screamed, running down the stairs despite her still healing injuries. "He's innocent. Mr. Hughes is the one who started the fire," but her voice was lost in the chaos of the arrest. Two officers held her back as Michael was driven away, her desperate pleas echoing in the morning air. The media descended like a storm. Headlines screamed about the millionaire who had harbored a dangerous child and then resorted to arson to protect her. Hughes played his part perfectly, appearing on local news to express his deep concern about Michael's descent into criminal behavior. "I tried to warn him about that girl," Hughes told reporters. his face a mask of false concern. Some people are beyond saving, but Anderson wouldn't listen. Now look where his obsession has led him. The community, already primed to believe the worst, accepted this narrative without question. Sarah was taken to a children's shelter, her world crumbling for the second time. The other children avoided her, having seen her face on the news. The staff treated her with clinical detachment, clearly believing she was responsible for Michael's downfall. At night she would cry silently into her pillow, the weight of guilt threatening to crush her. Michael's legal team worked frantically to secure his release, but Hugh's influence ran deep. Evidence vanished from police files, witnesses suddenly changed their stories, and judges known for their fairness were mysteriously replaced with ones who had connections to Hugh's family. In his cell, Michael refused to break. He used his one phone call not to contact his lawyers, but to ensure Sarah was being properly cared for. Don't give up hope, he told her through a social worker. The truth will come out. Stay strong, his words gave her courage, but the separation was almost unbearable. The business empire Michael had built began to crumble. Shareholders demanded his resignation, partners distanced themselves, and projects years in the making were suddenly cancelled. His reputation, built over decades of honest work, was being systematically destroyed. Sarah couldn't bear the thought that Michael was suffering because of her. One night, she considered going to the police and confessing to everything Hughes had accused her of, thinking it might free Michael. But her mother's words from her near-death experience echoed in her mind, "The truth needs you." The arrest took its toll on Michael physically. Prison life was hard on a man accustomed to comfort, but he bore it with quiet dignity. Other inmates, hearing his story, offered protection, moved by his sacrifice for a child who wasn't his own. Visiting hours were the hardest. Seeing Sarah across the table, noticing how thin she had become, how the light in her eyes dimmed a little more each time, tested Michael's resolve. But he maintained his optimism for her sake, even as the evidence against him mounted. "Remember what I told you the day I found you in the cemetery?" he asked during one visit. "I believed in you then, and I believe in you now. Don't let them win by giving up." Sarah nodded, fighting back tears, clutching the visiting room phone so tight her knuckles turned white. The arrest seemed to be the culmination of Hugh's victory, the final proof that he could manipulate the system to destroy anyone who opposed him. But he had underestimated the bond between Michael and Sarah, a connection that would prove stronger than any prison walls or false accusations. As Michael sat in his cell each night, he didn't pray for his own freedom. Instead, he prayed for Sarah's strength, for her safety, and for justice to finally prevail. He knew that somewhere in the darkness the truth was waiting to be discovered. It was just a matter of time. Life at the Riverside Children's Shelter was a different kind of prison for Sarah. The building itself was clean and well-maintained, but the atmosphere was heavy with judgment and suspicion. Staff members watched her constantly, as if expecting her to suddenly become the dangerous criminal Hughes had painted her to be. The other children gave her a wide berth, whispering behind their hands when she passed. Some had seen her story on the news, while others had been warned by their social workers to stay away from the girl who got the millionaire arrested. Meals were eaten in isolation, recreation time spent alone in a corner of the playground, nights passed in a small room that felt more like a cell than a bedroom. "You should be grateful," Mrs. Patterson, the head caretaker, would say with barely concealed disdain. "Most children with your history end up in juvenile detention. You're lucky to be here at all." The words were delivered with a smile that never reached her eyes, a reminder that even those meant to protect her believed the worst. Sarah's few possessions, the photograph of her mother, some clothes Michael had bought her, books they had read together, were accidentally damaged or lost. When she reported the missing items, the staff suggested she was lying for attention. "Just like you lied about Mr. Hughes," one worker muttered, not quite under her breath. The mandatory counseling sessions were exercises in futility. The therapist, Dr. Roberts, had clearly made up his mind about her guilt before their first meeting. "Let's talk about why you feel the need to manipulate people," he would begin, his pen poised to record her confessions. Sarah learned to sit in silence during these sessions, retreating into memories of better days. Nights were the worst. The shelter's strict rules meant lights out at 8:30 p.m., leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts in the darkness. She would lie awake, listening to distant traffic and wondering if Michael was also awake in his cell, thinking of her. The guilt of his imprisonment weighed heavily, making sleep elusive. The few times she did sleep, nightmares plagued her. She would dream of Hughes setting fires that consumed everything: the restaurant, Michael's mansion, the shelter, while everyone watched and applauded. She would wake gasping, only to find no comfort in consciousness. Mail was strictly monitored, but Sarah tried writing to Michael anyway. Most of her letters were lost before reaching the post office, but she kept writing, pouring her heart onto pages that would never be read. "I'm trying to be strong," she wrote, "like you taught me. Like Mom would want me to be. But it's so hard when everyone believes the lies." Her education, which had flourished under Michael's care, came to a virtual standstill. The shelter school program was basic at best, and teachers seemed uninterested in helping the criminal child learn. Sarah took to borrowing books from the shelter's small library, reading under her blanket with a flashlight she had managed to keep hidden. The other children's parents would visit regularly, bringing treats and hugs and love. Sarah would watch these reunions from her window, each one a reminder of what she had lost twice now. The few times Michael's lawyers visited to discuss the case, meetings were supervised, with every word recorded and analyzed. One day, Sarah found a small kitten hiding in the shelter's garden. For a brief moment, she felt a connection to another living being that didn't judge her. But when staff discovered her feeding it scraps from her meals, the kitten was quickly relocated, another small cruelty in a growing list. Some nights, when the loneliness became unbearable, Sarah would sneak up to the shelter's roof. There, under the stars, she would talk to her mother and to Michael, sharing her fears and hopes with the night sky. These moments of solitude became her sanctuary, the only time she felt she could truly be herself. The isolation took its toll. Sarah grew thinner, quieter, more withdrawn. The spark of fight that Michael had nurtured began to dim under the constant weight of suspicion and judgment. Yet somewhere deep inside, a small flame of hope remained alive, hope that somehow, someday, the truth would finally be heard. The community's judgment of Sarah reached new heights following Michael's arrest. Local newspapers ran daily features analyzing her criminal behavior, with experts speculating about psychological disorders and troubled childhoods. Former neighbors from her life before Hughes came forward with fabricated stories of early warning signs they claimed to have noticed. Church groups that had once offered prayers for Sarah's salvation now used her as a cautionary tale in their sermons. "See how evil can wear an innocent face," they warned their congregations. "The devil works through the most unexpected vessels." Parents used her story to frighten their children into obedience. "Be good, or you'll end up like that Miller girl." The shelter received a steady stream of letters demanding Sarah's removal from the community. Some suggested sending her to juvenile detention, others recommended psychiatric facilities, and a few contained threats that forced the shelter to increase security. Each piece of hate mail was carefully filed away, adding to the narrative of her supposed danger to society. Local businesses posted her photograph behind their counters with instructions to call the police if she was seen on their premises. When the shelter took children on supervised outings, shops would suddenly close, displaying technical difficulty signs until the group had passed. Sarah learned to recognize the sound of locks clicking shut as she walked by. Even medical care became a challenge. The hospital that had treated her after the fire now refused to schedule follow-up appointments, citing security concerns. The few doctors willing to see her did so with obvious reluctance, rushing through examinations while wearing their distrust openly. Social media amplified the isolation. Teenagers created cruel memes about the devil child, sharing edited photos that made her look sinister. Local news websites had to disable comments on stories about her case because of the violent suggestions being posted. The digital persecution was relentless and far-reaching. Former friends from school posted videos exposing Sarah's past behavior, inventing incidents that never happened but gained thousands of views. One particularly viral post claimed she had tortured neighborhood pets before her mother's death, leading to a formal investigation that found no evidence but added to her notoriety. The isolation extended to the shelter staff, who faced criticism for housing her. Several employees quit rather than be associated with her care, and those who remained treated their duties as a form of punishment. Volunteers cancelled their commitments, leaving the shelter understaffed and the other children deprived of activities. Professional services became increasingly difficult to access. Tutors refused to work with her, therapists claimed their practices were full, and even the shelter's regular maintenance workers would delay repairs to her room. The message was clear: she was untouchable, contaminated by accusations that grew more elaborate with each retelling. Sarah's only human contact came from mandatory interactions with shelter staff and occasional visits from Michael's lawyers. Even the other children in the shelter were forbidden by their social workers from speaking to her, creating an invisible barrier that followed her through every day. The isolation began to manifest physically. Sarah developed insomnia, lost weight, and started experiencing anxiety attacks. Her skin grew pale from spending so much time indoors, away from judgmental eyes. The shelter's doctor noted these changes but attributed them to guilt manifestation rather than the effects of social isolation. Local government officials, sensing the public mood, began discussing changes to shelter policies that would allow them to segregate high-risk individuals. Everyone knew these discussions were aimed at Sarah, though her name was never mentioned in the official documents. The proposed changes would have effectively placed her in solitary confinement. But the few people who tried to show kindness faced immediate backlash. A junior staff member who smuggled extra food to Sarah was fired for compromising shelter security. A local reporter who attempted to write a balanced article about her case received death threats and had to leave town. As weeks turned into months, the isolation became normal for Sarah. She learned to move silently through the shelter, to make herself invisible, to expect and accept rejection as her default state of existence. The vibrant, healing girl who had begun to emerge under Michael's care retreated behind walls built of society's judgment. Yet in this complete isolation, Sarah found an unexpected strength. Like a plant growing through concrete, she developed a resilience born of necessity. Each day of survival became a quiet rebellion against those who wished to see her break. She held on to Michael's words, "The truth needs no audience to remain true." Hughes appeared to be at the height of his power. With Michael in jail and Sarah isolated in the shelter, he moved through the community like a conquering hero. His restaurant, rebuilt after the fire with insurance money, became a gathering place for those who supported his version of events. He played the role of the victimized businessman perfectly, accepting sympathy with practiced humility. Local media celebrated his resilience in the face of adversity. He gave interviews describing how he had tried to help Sarah, painting himself as a charitable man whose kindness had been repaid with violence and destruction. Each appearance was carefully crafted to reinforce his image as the victim while subtly undermining any support remaining for Sarah or Michael. "I blame myself, really," he would say, his voice thick with false emotion. "I should have seen the signs when I first took her in. But I wanted to believe in second chances." The community ate up his performance, praising his forgiveness while condemning those who had wronged him. Hughes' influence grew beyond the local level. He was invited to speak at regional business conferences about overcoming setbacks and maintaining faith in human nature. His story of perseverance attracted attention from state politicians, who began courting his support for their campaigns. His wealth increased as sympathy translated into customer loyalty. The restaurant's business boomed, with people waiting hours for tables to show their support. He launched a charitable foundation in his grandmother's name, supposedly to help troubled youth, though the funds seemed to disappear into administrative costs. Behind the scenes, Hughes tightened his grip on local power structures. He placed allies in key positions, from the police department to the city council. Those who questioned his version of events found themselves facing audit notices, licensing problems, or mysterious personal difficulties. The evidence against Michael seemed to multiply. New witnesses appeared, claiming to have seen him plotting with Sarah. Documents surfaced suggesting financial irregularities in his companies, carefully crafted to appear damning while falling apart under close scrutiny. Hughes orchestrated everything from the shadows, his hands clean of any direct involvement. His grandmother's estate was finally settled with Hughes as the sole beneficiary. The changed will vanished from the lawyer's office during a convenient break-in, and the new version named Hughes as the natural heir to her fortune. He used the money to expand his influence, buying property and businesses throughout the city. At social gatherings, Hughes would speak sadly of Michael's descent into obsession and Sarah's unfortunate tendencies. He mastered the art of character assassination through apparent sympathy, poor child, product of a broken home, and Anderson letting his guilt over never having children cloud his judgment. The shelter received regular donations from Hughes Foundation, each one accompanied by press coverage and subtle reminders of the danger they housed within their walls. The donations came with strings, increased surveillance, stricter protocols, all aimed at making Sarah's life more difficult while maintaining his benevolent image. His employees, carefully selected and well paid for their loyalty, spread stories about Sarah's time at the restaurant. They described incidents that never happened, each tale more dramatic than the last, building a mythology of evil around the young girl that seemed impossible to combat. Hughes even began writing a book, promoted as a cautionary tale about trust and redemption. Advance orders poured in, and a prominent publisher scheduled a national tour. His triumph seemed complete. Not only had he destroyed his enemies, but he would profit from their destruction. The community's support emboldened him. He became more open in his displays of power, less careful about maintaining his facade of humility. Those close to him saw glimpses of his true nature, the cruelty beneath the charitable exterior, but fear kept them silent. His weekly visits to the prison where Michael was held became public spectacles. He would arrive in expensive cars, dressed immaculately, to offer forgiveness to his former accuser. These visits, always refused by Michael, served to reinforce Hughes' narrative of moral superiority. Yet in his moment of apparent victory, Hughes made a crucial mistake. Success made him careless, confident that his position was unassailable. He began keeping detailed records of his manipulations, a private chronicle of his triumph over justice. This hubris, this need to document his own cleverness, would ultimately prove to be his undoing. For now, though, Hughes reigned supreme over his small domain, seemingly untouchable in his power and influence. The truth lay buried beneath layers of lies and manipulation, while justice remained a distant dream for those who dared to challenge him. The turning point came from an unexpected source. During a routine cleaning of the shelter's communal area, Sarah discovered a small device that had fallen from her old clothes, a miniature voice recorder Michael had secretly placed in Hughes' restaurant weeks before his arrest. With trembling hands, Sarah examined the device, barely larger than a thumb drive. It was scratched and scorched from the fire, but appeared otherwise intact. Her heart racing, she realized this might be the evidence they had been searching for, preserved through all the chaos that followed. Late that night, after the other children were asleep, Sarah huddled under her blanket with a pair of earbuds she had borrowed from another resident. The recorder crackled to life, revealing hours of ambient restaurant noise, customer conversations, and kitchen clatter. But as she listened further, Hughes' voice emerged clearly through the static. "The old woman's getting suspicious," his voice sneered in one recording. "Keeps asking questions about the girl, threatening to change her will. Well, we'll see how that works out for her." The sound of liquid being poured followed, then a cold laugh. "A few more doses should do it." Another recording captured Hughes on the phone. "Yes, everything's arranged. Once the grandmother's out of the way, there'll be no one to verify the girl's story. Anderson's evidence will look like desperate fabrications from a man obsessed with playing hero. Sarah's hands shook as she continued listening. Hours of incriminating conversations unfolded, Hughes discussing bribes to officials, planning the restaurant fire, orchestrating Michael's arrest. Each word was a nail in the coffin of his carefully constructed facade. The most damning evidence came from the night before the fire. Hughes could be heard clearly discussing his plans with someone. The grandmother's death is perfect cover. Everyone will believe the girl killed her, and once the restaurant burns, any evidence of what really happened goes up in smoke. But getting the recording to the right people proved challenging. Sarah knew the shelter staff would confiscate it if they discovered it. She needed someone she could trust, someone beyond Hughes' influence. The opportunity came during her next scheduled meeting with Michael's lawyers. While the supervising staff member was distracted by a phone call, Sarah managed to slip the device to Catherine Martinez, Michael's lead attorney, along with a hastily scribbled note explaining its contents. Catherine, understanding the significance of what she had been given, immediately secured the device in a sealed evidence bag. She left the shelter quickly, before anyone could question what had transpired during the meeting. That night, as Sarah lay in her bed, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. The truth had literally been in Hughes' restaurant all along, recording his crimes in his own words. For the first time since Michael's arrest, she allowed herself to imagine a future where justice might prevail. The recorder's existence had to be kept secret until the evidence could be properly analyzed and authenticated. Any leak would give Hughes time to destroy other evidence or flee. Sarah maintained her usual routine at the shelter, giving no indication that anything had changed. Inside, though, she was bursting with the knowledge that Hughes' carefully constructed world was about to crumble. Every sneer from the staff, every whispered insult from the other children, became bearable. She had found the key to their freedom, preserved through fire and chaos by what seemed like divine intervention. As she drifted to sleep that night, Sarah whispered a quiet thank you to Michael for his foresight in planting the recorder, and to whatever force had kept it safe until she could find it. The tiny device, overlooked by everyone including Hughes himself, would prove to be the instrument of his downfall. The forensic analysis of the recording device sparked a rapid chain of events. Catherine Martinez assembled a team of audio experts who worked around the clock to enhance the recordings and verify their authenticity. Each revelation was more damning than the last, building an irrefutable case against Hughes. The most shocking evidence came from a conversation recorded 3 days before Mrs. Bennett's death. Hughes was speaking to someone identified only as the chemist discussing the effects of a rare, slow-acting poison. "It's perfect," Hughes could be heard saying. "The symptoms mimic natural causes, and by the time she falls, any trace will be impossible to detect." Further investigation revealed a series of payments from Hughes to a disgraced pharmaceutical researcher, matching the dates of Mrs. Bennett's declining health. The researcher, when confronted with the evidence, broke down and confessed to supplying Hughes with the poison, providing detailed documentation of their transactions. The recordings also captured Hughes' reaction to learning about his grandmother's changed will. His rage was terrifying, that interfering old witch. "Giving my inheritance to charity. I've spent years playing the dutiful grandson, waiting for her to die, and now this." The sound of breaking glass punctuated his fury. Mrs. Bennett's lawyer came forward with additional evidence, including notes she had made about her suspicions regarding Hughes' treatment of Sarah. "My grandson is not the man I thought he was," she had written. "The way he treats that poor child. I cannot in good conscience leave him my fortune." The most damning recording captured Hughes actually administering the poison. The soft clink of a spoon stirring tea, his grandmother's trusting voice thanking him, and his sickeningly sweet response, "Drink up, grandmother dear. It's a special blend, just for you." The calculated cruelty in his tone sent chills through everyone who heard it. Laboratory analysis of Mrs. Bennet's personal effects, preserved after her death, revealed traces of the poison on her favorite teacup. The compound matched exactly what the chemist had described, proving that her accidental death had been carefully orchestrated. Hughes had documented everything in his private journal, which was discovered hidden in his office safe. The entries revealed a systematic plan to eliminate his grandmother while using Sarah as a convenient scapegoat. "The street rat's presence is proving useful," he wrote. "No one will question when she's blamed for the old woman's death." The evidence mounted financial records showing Hughes was nearly bankrupt before his grandmother's death, emails coordinating with corrupt officials to cover his tracks, and detailed plans for framing both Sarah and Michael once his grandmother was gone. Police analysts discovered that Hughes had even recorded videos of himself practicing his grieving grandson act in preparation for his grandmother's death. The footage showed him rehearsing different expressions of sorrow, perfecting the tremor in his voice when speaking of her tragic accident. As the truth emerged, those who had enabled Hughes began turning against him. The corrupt officials, fearing for their own freedom, started offering evidence in exchange for leniency. Each new revelation painted a picture of a man who had orchestrated an elaborate murder while manipulating an entire community into blaming an innocent child. The final piece of evidence came from Mrs. Bennet herself. She had recorded a video testament just days before her death, expressing her fears about Hughes and her desire to protect Sarah. "If anything happens to me," she stated clearly, "investigate my grandson. He is not what he seems." This cache of evidence represented not just proof of Hughes' crimes, but vindication for both Sarah and Michael. Every recorded word, every documented action, systematically dismantled the web of lies Hughes had so carefully constructed. The truth about Mrs. Bennet's death was finally clear. Hughes had murdered her in cold blood, using a poison designed to make her weak and vulnerable. Sarah's accidental collision with her on the street had simply provided him with a convenient opportunity to complete his plan while shifting blame to an innocent child. The truth about Sarah's innocence burst into public consciousness like a tidal wave. Local news stations interrupted regular programming to break the story. Their headlines, stark and damning local businessman, exposed the real story behind the Bennett death. The recording device's contents, now properly analyzed and verified, became the centerpiece of a scandal that rocked the community. Catherine Martinez orchestrated a masterful press conference, playing select portions of Hughes' recorded confessions. The audience sat in stunned silence as they heard his cold-blooded planning of his grandmother's murder, his cruel treatment of Sarah, and his elaborate scheme to frame both her and Michael Anderson. Former employees of the restaurant, no longer afraid of Hughes' retaliation, came forward en masse. They described witnessing Sarah's abuse, Hughes' manipulation of evidence, and the systematic exploitation of other vulnerable children. Each testimony added another layer to the mounting evidence of Hughes' crimes. The community's reaction shifted dramatically. Those who had been Sarah's loudest accusers now faced their own guilt in perpetuating Hughes' lies. The same social media platforms that had once spread vicious rumors about her now exploded with messages of support and apology. Justice for Sarah began trending locally, then nationally. But local officials who had supported Hughes found themselves under intense scrutiny. The mayor called for a full investigation into every case Hughes had influenced, every permit he'd been granted, every inspection he'd suspiciously passed. The web of corruption began to unravel, revealing the full extent of his influence. Sarah watched it all unfold from the shelter, where staff members who had treated her with contempt now awkwardly offered apologies. The other children, finally understanding the truth, tried to include her in their activities. But the damage of months of isolation couldn't be undone overnight. Michael's release from prison was expedited as the evidence mounted. The sight of him walking free, broadcast on every local channel, brought tears to Sarah's eyes. His first stop was the shelter, where he arrived with court papers not just for Sarah's release, but for her adoption. The revelations continued to emerge. Hughes' careful documentation of his crimes, found in multiple locations, provided irrefutable evidence of his guilt. His private journals revealed a calculated sociopath who had manipulated an entire community while systematically destroying innocent lives. As the truth spread, the community began its own painful reckoning. Churches that had condemned Sarah held special services asking for forgiveness. Schools that had rejected her now sent letters of apology and invitation. Business owners who had posted her photo as a warning now replaced them with welcome signs. The final vindication came with the release of Mrs. Bennet's sealed letter to her lawyer, written days before her death. In it, she expressed not only her suspicions about Hughes but her deep concern for Sarah's welfare. The letter transformed Mrs. Bennet from a victim into a posthumous witness for the truth. Sarah's innocence was no longer a matter of debate. The same community that had once shunned her now celebrated her resilience and courage. But for Sarah, the most important validation came from the quiet knowledge that she had never given up, never stopped believing in the truth, even when she stood alone. The truth had finally emerged, not through dramatic confrontations or clever detective work, but through the simple preservation of Hughes' own words. His arrogance in recording his crimes had become the instrument of his downfall, and Sarah's path to vindication. The arrest of Jackson Hughes became a spectacle that captivated the entire city. FBI agents and local police surrounded his newly rebuilt restaurant during the lunch rush, their sirens silent but lights flashing a warning to everyone inside. Hughes, sensing the end was near, attempted to flee through the kitchen's back door, only to find himself face to face with a wall of tactical officers. Jackson Hughes, the lead agent, announced, his voice carrying across the now silent street, "You are under arrest for the murder of Eleanor Bennett, child exploitation, attempted murder, fraud, and conspiracy to obstruct justice." The list of charges continued as Hughes was led out in handcuffs, his carefully maintained facade crumbling with each step. The evidence against him was overwhelming. In addition to the recorded confessions, investigators discovered a hidden room in his office containing detailed records of his crimes. Financial documents showed years of money laundering, while medical records proved his systematic poisoning of his grandmother. Most damning were the videos he had recorded of himself practicing his grieving grandson performance. Hughes' network of corrupt officials quickly collapsed. Those he had bribed and blackmailed rushed to make deals with prosecutors, each revelation adding new charges to his growing list of crimes. The investigation expanded to include other cities where Hughes had operated restaurants, uncovering a pattern of exploitation spanning decades. In the courthouse, Hughes finally faced those he had wronged. Sarah, standing between Michael and Catherine Martinez, watched as he was led past in his prison jumpsuit. Gone was the confident businessman who had terrorized her in his place, shuffled a defeated man, unable to meet the eyes of his victims. The trial lasted 3 weeks, though it could have been shorter. The prosecutors wanted every detail on record, every crime exposed to the light. Hughes' own meticulous documentation of his crimes became the strongest evidence against him. His private journals revealed a level of calculation that shocked even hardened court veterans. The jury took less than 2 hours to reach their verdict. As the forewoman read out guilty on all counts, a collective exhale seemed to pass through the courtroom. Hughes showed no emotion, but his hands trembled as he was led away to begin serving multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. Justice had finally caught up with Jackson Hughes. The man who had built an empire on others' suffering would spend the rest of his life in a maximum security prison, his name becoming synonymous with betrayal and evil in the community he had once dominated. For Sarah, watching Hughes being led away to prison brought not joy but a quiet sense of closure. The nightmare that had begun in his restaurant was finally over. As she left the courthouse with Michael, reporters clamored for comments, but she only smiled softly. Justice had spoken louder than any words could. The adoption ceremony took place in Judge Martha Thompson's chambers on a bright spring morning. The room was intimate, filled only with those who had stood by Sarah through her darkest days: Catherine Martinez, Dr. Stevens, and a few loyal members of Michael's staff. Sarah wore a new blue dress, chosen because it reminded her of one her mother had worn. Michael had spent weeks ensuring everything was perfect. The paperwork was meticulously prepared, every requirement met and exceeded. He had even renovated a wing of his mansion specifically for Sarah, filling it with books, art supplies, and everything a young girl might need to feel at home. As Judge Thompson reviewed the final documents, Sarah held Michael's hand tightly. Her eyes kept moving to the framed photograph of her mother. She had brought with her a silent witness to this new chapter in her life. Michael had insisted on having it present, understanding that this day wasn't about replacing Sarah's past but building upon it. Sarah Miller, Judge Thompson began, her voice warm with emotion. Today you legally become Sarah Miller Anderson, but more importantly, you're officially gaining the father who has already proven his love for you through his actions. The judge paused, looking at both Sarah and Michael with genuine affection. I've never seen a clearer case of two people belonging together as family. The moment when Sarah signed her new name was powerful in its simplicity. Her hand trembled slightly, but her signature was clear and strong. Michael signed next, his usual confident signature softened by the tears in his eyes. Judge Thompson's final signature made it official. They were now, legally and irrevocably, father and daughter. I promise to always protect you, Michael whispered as they hugged, his voice thick with emotion. You'll never be alone again. Sarah couldn't speak, but her tight embrace said everything words couldn't. Catherine Martinez, who had fought so hard for this day to happen, presented Sarah with a special gift, a locket containing photos of both her mother and Michael. To remind you that love multiplies, she explained. It doesn't divide. Dr. Stevens watched with professional satisfaction, seeing in Sarah's smile the fulfillment of months of healing work. The traumatized girl who had first come to her office was now standing straight and tall, ready to embrace her future with a father who had proven his devotion through the darkest of times. As they left the courthouse, they found the steps lined with supporters, shelter staff who had finally recognized the truth, teachers eager to have Sarah in their classes, and community members holding signs of congratulation and welcome. The same community that had once shunned her now celebrated her happiness. This wasn't just an adoption, it was a redemption, a new beginning, and a testament to the power of love over fear. Sarah Miller Anderson walked down those courthouse steps holding her father's hand, stepping into a future bright with promise and possibility. The transformation of the community following Hugh's conviction and Sarah's adoption became a story of collective healing and redemption. Those who had once shunned Sarah now sought ways to make amends, turning their guilt into action. The local school board established a scholarship fund in her name, dedicated to helping children who had faced similar hardships. Michael transformed Hugh's former restaurant into a community center for at-risk youth, naming it Eleanor's Place in honor of Mrs. Bennett. The center provided meals, education, and support services to children in need, ensuring that no child in their community would ever again suffer in silence. Sarah often volunteered there, her presence a living testament to resilience and forgiveness. The annual Truth and Reconciliation Festival became a city tradition, celebrating the power of justice and community healing. Each year, Sarah would share her story, not to condemn but to educate, helping others understand the importance of looking beyond appearances and standing up for truth. Former shelter staff who had mistreated Sarah organized support groups for children in foster care, working to change the system from within. Mrs. Patterson, the head caretaker who had been particularly harsh, became one of the most vocal advocates for reform, frequently testifying before state committees about the need for more compassionate care. Local business owners who had posted warnings about Sarah now displayed signs promoting kindness and inclusion. The bakery that had once refused to serve her became a gathering place for community outreach programs, offering free meals to homeless youth and job training for those seeking a fresh start. Sarah's school experience transformed from one of isolation to celebration. Her academic achievements were matched by her growing confidence in leadership roles. She established a peer support group for students facing personal challenges, creating a safe space for others to share their stories and find strength in unity. The press that had once vilified her now celebrated her accomplishments. Local newspapers ran regular features on the positive changes she and Michael had initiated in the community. Their father-daughter relationship became a symbol of hope, proving that family bonds could be forged through love and choice rather than just blood. Churches that had condemned her now sought her input on youth programs. Sarah worked with religious leaders to develop outreach initiatives for vulnerable children, ensuring that faith communities became sources of support rather than judgment. Michael used his business influence to create employment opportunities for at-risk youth, establishing apprenticeship programs that provided both job skills and mentorship. The community's wealthy elite, following his example, began investing in similar social initiatives. As Sarah prepared for college, her acceptance speech as class valedictorian touched on themes of forgiveness and growth. "Our community's journey," she said, "proves that it's never too late to right a wrong, to choose kindness over fear, to build bridges where walls once stood." The final symbol of community reconciliation came when the City Council unanimously voted to establish an annual Sarah Miller Anderson Day dedicated to celebrating resilience and promoting child welfare awareness. The day became known for its volunteer activities and community service projects. Looking out over the changed landscape of their city, Sarah and Michael often reflected on how far they had come. The pain of the past had been transformed into purpose, the injustice into inspiration for change. Their story had become more than just a personal triumph. It was a testament to the power of truth, love, and the human capacity for transformation. The community had learned its lesson, but more importantly, it had grown from it. Sarah's journey from accused outcast to beloved leader became a cornerstone of the city's identity, a reminder that hope can flourish even in the darkest of circumstances. Dear viewers, thank you for joining us on this emotional journey through Sarah's story of resilience and redemption. We'd love to hear your thoughts and feelings about her extraordinary path to justice and healing. What moments touched you the most? What lessons resonated with you? Please share your perspectives in the comments below. If you found value in this narrative, consider subscribing to our channel for more compelling stories that explore the depths of human spirit. Every subscription helps us continue creating meaningful content. Don't forget to like this video and share it with friends and family who might find inspiration in Sarah's journey. Together, we can spread messages of hope, resilience, and the triumph of truth.